And welcome to another update on Bitcoin. In this specific video, I want to talk about what's been happening so far on the long-term, bigger time frame charts of Bitcoin. So for example, the weekly charts, the monthly charts, and so on and so on. Now, before I show you these charts, let's put everything in context. You may recall back in April, I did an interview with Cointelegraph. And back then in April, here's what I said in that interview.
So Alessio, what's your take on Bitcoin's short-term price action? What targets are you looking at right now?
And I would say I remain bullish on Bitcoin as long as we remain above this key support, about 6,600. So we've got 5 waves already in this rally. This 5-wave rally tells me that we're in the beginning of a major, this to me is wave 1 of a longer term bull market in Bitcoin. So guys, back in April, at that time I said, look, this is a bottom in the price of Bitcoin. It's a bull market, very likely. And this rally is very likely to start a major bull market in Bitcoin. And so far, that prediction has turned out to be true. And in fact, some weeks ago, you may remember, in fact, last month, I said this about Bitcoin.
Now, this chart you're looking at here, as you can see, is a different calculation of Bitcoin. It's not a candlestick chart. It's a special chart I mentioned before. It's called a line break chart. It's a 3-line break chart, to be exact here. Now, as you can see on this chart, it's a daily chart, a daily line break chart of Bitcoin. Notice I've drawn a downtrend line. I've connected the highs on this chart, the daily chart of the line break chart of Bitcoin. And it tells you something very interesting. Notice where that trend line is coming down on that chart. Okay, you can see that? And that is a very important line now on the chart of Bitcoin, that trend line. Because, let me just give you some examples. In previous occasions, when we formed this kind of trend line on Bitcoin, actually on other charts too, not just Bitcoin, but what's happened before, for example, here's a chart of Bitcoin from 2019, when we last had formed this pattern, sort of a downtrend on the chart of Bitcoin. And notice what happened when Bitcoin eventually broke out of that trend line. This is back in 2019 now. Notice eventually when Bitcoin broke this line break chart, it's a line break chart of Bitcoin. When Bitcoin eventually broke to the upper side of that trend line, that was a very bullish signal. It was a very bullish action because that increased the probability of a move higher for Bitcoin. So that means when a line break chart forms a trend line like that, and when the price eventually breaks the upside of that trend line, that can often become a very powerful bullish signal for Bitcoin. That is very similar to what we're seeing right now, by the way. You can see on the chart of Bitcoin. Now, let me give another example. Here's another example for you on Bitcoin. It's from a few years ago on Bitcoin. As you can see, again, we can see a kind of a downtrend line, and eventually Bitcoin broke the upper part of that trend. I think this is back in 2015. Now, eventually when Bitcoin broke that trend line, we actually went into a nice uptrend in the chart of Bitcoin as well. So very powerful signal, very powerful chart when something like this forms on the line break chart. Now, here's another example for you, this time in the stock markets. And again, you can see very similar pattern, broke it, boom, it went higher. And here's another example for you. This one in the opposite direction now. And you can see when this chart, the price, broke the trend line in the downside direction. Again, when it broke the trend line in the downward direction, we had a nice move to the downside here in this chart as well. So again, the bottom line is when a pattern like this forms, again, on any chart, doesn't have to be Bitcoin, it can be stock markets, can be currencies, doesn't really matter. When something like this forms, again, when the trend line forms and when the price breaks a trend line, especially on a line break chart, that can be a very powerful signal. Again, bullish or bearish, depending on which side of the trend line it breaks. Bottom line is, guys, if Bitcoin can now break that trend line in the next few weeks and months, that can be a very powerful signal for Bitcoin, a very bullish signal on Bitcoin. So as long as Bitcoin can remain above that low, the most recent low on the chart, I still remain bullish on Bitcoin. On the line break chart, I remain bullish, and I still think there's a good chance Bitcoin could break the upper part of that trend line and break the trend line and move higher in a bullish direction in the next few weeks and months. So in other words, guys, keeping it simple, breaking that trend line for Bitcoin in the next few weeks and months could be very important and a very bullish signal for Bitcoin as well.
So in that video, I showed you a line chart of Bitcoin, and we connected the highs, as you can see on that chart. And Bitcoin has now, on that line chart, has broken above that falling trend line. That's an enormously bullish, it's a very bullish chart, as a matter of fact. As I explained to you in a previous video, whenever Bitcoin has done this in the past, this has tended to be a very bullish sign, and a sign of a bull market indeed in BTC. So given the fact we've now broken above this downward trend line, I think it's an enormously long-term bullish sign for Bitcoin. And I think the break of this trend line on this chart is indicating a multi-month and multi-year bull market, similar to what we saw the last time it happened back in 2015, as a matter of fact. Now, of course, could I be wrong about this? Yes, of course, I could be wrong. If Bitcoin falls back below this trend line, I'll have to change my mind. As simple as that. So we have to be open to probabilities. We have to be open to possibilities. And therefore, we need to be open to the idea that we could be wrong. And there's a significant risk, of course, that the market could just do the opposite. But the bottom line is that we have to go with the facts, and I'm going with the facts as it is. So given the fact that Bitcoin has given us an enormously bullish sign, breaking through this trend line, I think that this shows to us a multi-month, multi-year bull market in BTC. So for me personally, I think that what I would like to see in the next few months, I think perhaps by the end of the year, what I would like to see is a retracement, a correction in the price of Bitcoin. I think that correction could start about the same time as the correction in the stock market. We've seen, for example, a correlation, a positive correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market on the S&P, for example. So I think when the stock market begins its own correction or retracement, we could see a similar correlated correction on BTC as well. I think that's quite likely, as a matter of fact. So once that correction or retracement occurs, and I think it's possible that Bitcoin may again pull back to some important support level. I mentioned before, it's possible that Bitcoin may even come back to the 10K level again. Again, it's likely and indeed probable that Bitcoin may test the 10K or sub 10K level briefly. I think it'll be quite brief, maybe for a few days or a few weeks, before once again we hold that level, bounce from that level, and again rally significantly higher as we head towards next year. All right, guys. So again, I think that the prospects for Bitcoin, given this breakout, are enormously bullish. And again, once that correction or major retracement occurs, potentially by the end of the year, that perhaps could be the next major buying opportunity for Bitcoin bulls on the balance of probabilities.